Welcome back to our live coverage here at reInvent 2023. I'm A.M. Grabelny. I'm a developer advocate here for Game Day, and I'm joined by George Mao. George.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Wonderful to see you. Distinguished engineer at Capital One, right?
Yes, I'm a distinguished engineer. I lead our serverless center of excellence, and my job is to help our company go serverless first.
Well, George, your reputation precedes you because I'm well aware of your work. We were just talking about Sam. You've been active, Sam Dingler too. Not to be confused with AWS Sam. But you've been very active in the serverless world for a long time. I've seen your work. Very excited to be able to get to talk to you.
Yeah.
I got to start. What's been the journey like moving over to Capital One?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I used to work for AWS.
Yes.
I was the tech leader for serverless. Now I have the opportunity to help our company move into a more cloud-native, serverless-first organization.
Very nice.
And one of the reasons we're doing it is because we want our developers to focus on building apps that are unique and deliver features to our customers, rather than like worrying about infrastructure and EC2 and scaling and all those things.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody we are live. So if you've got questions, I've got chat pulled up for George. I'd love to hear from you all. But it sounds like we could go down the greatest hits list of serverless, right?
Yeah.
So for anybody who's not entrenched in the serverless world, you touched on a little bit there.
Yeah.
Why serverless though? Why are y'all so heavily invested in serverless at Capital One?
Yeah, so one of the things, if you work on AWS, you know that EC2 is, you manage everything from operating system up. AWS manages the hardware.
You got a lot of control, but you also got a lot of responsibility.
You have to patch, you have to scale, resiliency, scalability, all of that stuff.
Scan it regularly.
Everything, yeah.
Yep.
Vulnerabilities are really big, especially being in a regulated industry.
Oh yeah.
We have to address them. There's required deadlines we have to hit.
Yes.
So when we move to something like Lambda or even Fargate, if you're doing serverless containers, AWS does all of that heavy lifting.
Right.
Like we don't have to do anything.
Right.
The first thing our developers do is when they build Lambda functions, they write code for their use cases, and they don't have to worry about the next Windows patch that came out that they have to deliver in the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was reminiscing earlier. So my first trip to reInvent was 2017.
Okay.
I came here with a company I was at the time called Box.
Oh, cool.
Document storage.
Sure. Yeah.
And I was given a lightning talk all about this new thing, Lambda functions.
Oh, yeah.
And working with Box's API with a Lambda function, because doing things like working with a third-party API makes a lot of sense inside a Lambda function, because you don't need a full-on server just to call out to an API. So I was reminiscing, this was early on. People at that point, they thought I was blowing their minds with this type of stuff. And now it's become commonplace, right?
Sure.
I'd love to hear how you got into serverless and how you first. For me, it was all about, I've always been a coder, always been a dev.
Yeah.
The faster I could get to coding, worry less about deployment and managing all that stuff, the better. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. 2017 might have been my first reInvent as well.
Really?
I'm not sure. Either 2017 or 2016.
It all blurs together, doesn't it?
Yeah. Lambda launched in 2015, right?
Yeah.
And I've always been my background is all software engineering and development. So it's really easy for me to gravitate towards AWS services that are made for developers.
Right.
And when I was a developer, and we used to have to build these large deployment files and hand it over to our app team who would manage the server clusters.
Yes.
But then they would ask us what is the how much cluster size you need, what kind of hardware do you need? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm a software engineer.
I wrote the code. I didn't. You're supposed to run it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that it was always tough as a software application engineer to also have to worry about hardware and scaling.
Right.
So when Lambda came out, it was I thought it was amazing.
Same.
I got into it almost immediately. Started supporting with customers. Early on, it had a lot of missing features. Obviously, over the last decade, it's improved drastically.
Right.
And I worked with a lot of AWS engineers, GM of Lambda.
Yeah.
And been involved in Lambda since the beginning.
I love it. Yeah, we just heard from, I'm sure you know Julian Wood.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, he was on the show yesterday telling us all about the improvements to scaling, going over all the concurrency stuff. It was really interesting. He's always phenomenal, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, Lambda and serverless in general, right? Like all the serverless services that are out there that are even beyond Lambda functions, they've all had vast improvements since those early days. I mean, it's been really interesting to be along for the ride as a dev to see all the stuff going.
Yeah.
So you've set up this serverless center of excellence.
Yes.
Is that what you called it at Capital One?
Yeah.
Tell me what's going on there.
Sure. Yeah. So when we got into serverless, we declared we wanted to be a serverless-first organization a couple years ago. We have multiple lines of businesses. Right? We have the retail business, which builds applications that all customers interact with.
Yes.
And then we have card, which is like our credit card business. And there's a whole bunch of other ones.
Right.
But we wanted to make sure that we were making decisions that were suitable for every line of business.
Yeah.
And we wanted all of these lines of business to have a voice in like setting best practices and standards and requirements. And we learned that when we did early on, we made decisions that were impacting groups that we didn't know had opinions on this stuff.
Interesting.
Everything from like naming conventions to Lambda defaults, even like required runtimes. So we're a huge organization. Right? We're 10,000 engineers.
Yeah.
And so the COE helps us make the correct decisions that work for the enterprise. And it also helps to set best practices and roll out the way we want things to work at Capital One.
Okay.
So I think we're one of the largest users of Lambda in the world. And it's a little bit different from using like 2 Lambda functions, right?
Right.
When you have millions of them, you have to be able to manage them.
And that's in probably thousands of accounts.
Yeah,
too.
thousands of accounts, millions of Lambda functions. It's really tough to, if you don't have standards of management and control, you can't. How do you manage?
Right.
Like even 100.
Right. Yeah, so you're not logging into thousands of accounts. You're automating a lot of stuff, I imagine. We were talking through some engineering practices earlier and philosophies around that. It sounds like, and one of the things that came up was, a constant state of curiosity and learning and staying ahead of the changes that are coming in tech, which you never know what those changes will be, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like that's a huge part of what this Center of Excellence does, right? It's enablement for all of the engineering at Capital One.
Yeah. One thing our COE does is we also roll out training and enablement across the enterprise. So part of my team is responsible for doing weekly and monthly training sessions for the company, but as well as rolling out on-demand self-paced learning.
Wow.
So like some of the things that Lambda offers, we either don't allow or control.
Okay.
Right, how people can use Lambda.
Sure.
And so like the way we use Lambda might be a little bit different from how the native AWS like usage of it is.
Right. So you have to have specific training and specific enablement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tailored to that.
Yeah. So it stacks on top of what like AWS offers to the public.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's such a huge part of being an engineer is just always learning. Speaking of which, a lot of people watching right now are interested in that. And how do I learn, right? Do you have, just even from doing this at Capital One, but prior to that, your experience with serverless, how do you stay up to date? Do you have some tips and tricks for the people?
Sure. I think one of the best ways to build the foundational knowledge for serverless is there's a training course called serverless. It's right on the serverless website. I don't remember the exact URL, but
are you talking serverless land?
Serverless land has a bunch of patterns, which are awesome for like reference, like getting started, and a lot of code. But there's a serverless like certification you can get.
Okay.
And
yes, I know what you're talking about.
It's basically I'd say about 1 day of self-paced learning, followed with like a 50-question test.
Yeah, maybe in Skill Builder.
Yeah, you get a serverless badge.
Yes.
And that gives you all of the basic foundational knowledge for building serverless.
Yeah.
And it makes sure you don't start off going the wrong direction. And that's the most important. Like you don't want to go the wrong way.
I said we were gonna do the greatest hits, right? I mean, that is like the long running. When you first start using Lambda functions, a lot of people bring in these heavy like web frameworks, and they make these mono functions, and then they gradually start learning more and start separating it out into like more discrete things. How do you approach that? Like for somebody who's brand new, like what's the journey in today's world for?
Yeah. So what I found is there's really like two big things that our engineers have to learn, like the learning curve.
Right.
One is Lambda forces you to be small. You can't. Back when we were building like large ear files and war files, you can build them at like 300, 400 megs in size.
Right.
It didn't matter.
Right.
You can't. You physically can't like do that in Lambda. It's got to be 50 meg zipped. If you're doing zip deployments, you can get bigger with a Docker image, but that's kind of like the alternative. Shouldn't be doing that if you don't have to.
Yes.
So that's number one. It teaches engineers to be small, to be efficient. You don't want to do too much in a function. And the second thing is like concurrency.
Yeah.
So most engineers are used to requests per second as the driving factor, or TPS, RPS, right? And then the more you have, the more you scale in and out.
Right.
But with Lambda, concurrency is really the limiting factor. Is how many concurrent Lambda functions can you run and scale up into, right? Which is what you were talking about.
Yeah, with Julian, Julian gave us all those updates.
Yeah, it's like a 12x increase in concurrency speed, ramp-up speed. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah,
and you don't have to, this is, again, going back to what you were saying.
Yeah.
You have to do anything to opt in.
Yeah,
You don't have to change anything, no code updates. Now you just get this now.
Yep, definitely.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So it is a mindset kind of shift, I think, for more people who are maybe used to more web dev and things like that. So you also mentioned, Fargate and containers too.
Yep.
Where does that fall into play when y'all are using some serverless architecture?
Yep. Great question. So our strategy right now is we want to be, functions first.
Right.
But equally use serverless containers when there's a real need to.
Yeah,
because Lambda is great, but it doesn't meet every single use case.
And it's not intended to, right?
Yep. So we deploy both. In our serverless world, we use both technologies side by side. An application team might have both deployed.
Yeah.
Right? They might have one or the other or both. Any combination is good for us. We're trying to get into both.
The flexibility of the right tool for the right job, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And that goes back maybe to that enablement that y'all are giving, like how to identify the right tool for the right job. I'm sure you've all identified, this is a good time to use Fargate versus, for Capital One, right?
Yeah, this is a tough question because when I was at Amazon, we were never able to come up with like a decision tree.
Right.
Because it's not that simple.
No.
there's tons of nuances.
The SA answer, right? The solution architect, it depends.
It does. Right? So we have like an internal guide that we created that's a little more tailored to Capital One constraints as well. So AWS has helped us with a little bit of feedback in creating that.
That's cool. That's very cool.
But most of our engineers use that to decide whether Lambda or Fargate's the right choice.
Okay. Now, I know, again, probably a lot of people watching are like, okay, well, what if I considered a career at Capital One as an engineer? Can you talk to them about what they might be working on?
Oh, yeah.
Why should they come work for Capital One?
Sure. So a lot of people don't know this, but we are basically essentially structured like a tech company. We're also a bank.
Right.
But we're all in on the cloud. So we closed our last data center in 2020.
Oh.
And so we're operating, all in on AWS. If you come work for Capital One, you'll have the opportunity to basically build a ton of skills on AWS, build in the cloud, probably with a Lambda or serverless-first mindset.
Yeah.
And get to integrate with tons of cutting-edge cloud technologies.
That sounds exciting to me. That's super interesting. George, we got about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Any parting words for the audience? Anything you recommend or that they should go check out?
I guess Capital One has a ton of breakout sessions throughout the week.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to come learn about our journey on the cloud, both serverless and not. So I hope to see you all there.
Yeah, go check out George's talk. That great plug.
Cool.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
All right.